Hey everybody, Joe Rogan did a long podcast with Tulsi Gabbard yesterday, around 2.5 hours. It was very good. You should listen to the entire thing if you have a chance. Just wanted to highlight a couple parts. First, I think perhaps most notably, Tulsi declared that she would drop the charges against Julian Assange and Edward Snowden if she were president. Now, in the past, she had made statements hinting at that, but not outright explicitly saying so, as far as I know. So that's notable because, like much of what she says, it means that she is going to incur the wrath of people within her party who especially loathe Julian Assange. There's also a segment which strongly dislikes Edward Snowden. And it's not just limited to the Democratic Party either. Obviously, there are members of the national security establishment who view both of those individuals with extreme disdain. So if she was trying to somehow court people who are otherwise opposed to her and, hedge and, quote, evolve on her position, she's doing the exact opposite, because by taking that stance, she guarantees that there's going to be even more hostility directed at her in the media, like I said, within her party, and just more broadly. On the other hand, it does actually strengthen her in the sense of being able to cultivate a support base, especially on the internet, where she's gaining a lot of traction, where Assange and Snowden have some popularity, to put it lightly, at least within certain segments of the internet. So in terms of the demographics that she's wanting to solidify, it makes perfect sense that she would have done that, and I think it's also her genuine position. So in addition, when I tweeted a week and a half or so ago that Joe Rogan had endorsed Tulsi by saying that he would vote for her, some people replied to me saying, "Oh, Joe Rogan just has this air of cheekiness about him. He's not a serious political actor. You can't take seriously if he's endorsing somebody because he could just be joking or whatever." But I don't know how more explicit Joe Rogan can get about the fact that he's endorsing Tulsi, because on the podcast yesterday, he said, quote, to her, "I'd fully support you." I mean, you can dismiss that as more cheekiness, I guess, but again, tell me how much more explicit he could be in offering up an endorsement of a political candidate. Joe Rogan endorsed Ron Paul in 2012, right? Where he, went on the Jay Leno show wearing a Ron Paul shirt, and Ron Paul was also there on stage, and they held up their hands in that triumphant victory pose. So that was obviously Joe Rogan endorsing Ron Paul. And he's done the same now with Tulsi, and that ought not to be discounted because, again, I don't have to tell you guys, but Joe Rogan is one of the most popular figures on the internet. I don't know how that podcast ranks in terms of popularity, but it's got to be up there. If it's not the most popular, it's, among the top podcasts. The YouTube presence is insane. The UFC stuff speaks for itself. So, I mean, that's an extremely valuable endorsement. And a lot of people who watch Joe Rogan, especially young males, but not exclusively, have their worldviews informed by him. And when he dips his toe into electoral politics, I think a lot of people are going to take that very seriously. And Tulsi, I think, could very well receive a boost from it. It might not be overall evident in the polling, because many of the people watching Joe Rogan might not be registered Democrats and might not be polled right now. So she's expanding the electorate in that sense, if these people actually want to take the step of getting registered to vote for her and actively supporting her campaign. So, that's very significant, and I think needs to be taken seriously. Another thing that she did on the podcast was Joe Rogan brought up how he had this guest on his show somewhat recently who was the research director of New Knowledge, which is this firm that, portrays itself as the expert, source on online disinformation campaigns. And they particularly focus on Russian disinformation campaigns and try to gin up hysteria about that. The Senate has actually used New Knowledge as a main authority in terms of their investigation of Russian interference on social media in particular. So Joe Rogan had this person on named Renee DiResta a while ago, and he cited her to Tulsi when discussing, the Internet Research Agency and the scary onslaught of Russian trolls, which are like destroying American democracy or something. And Tulsi actually didn't accept Joe's premises in his depiction of that supposed menace. Instead, she pointed out that New Knowledge got caught last year creating fake Russian bot accounts to, cause trouble in the 2017 Alabama special election for the Senate, where Doug Jones eventually won over Roy Moore, because New Knowledge wanted to confabulate this Russian bot presence in that race so there could be the wider Russian interference narrative brought in to depict what was going on in that race on false pretenses. And and Tulsi criticized that also because when she announced her campaign, or rather when she did her first formal campaign speech on February 2nd, I believe it was. Let me just double check that really quick, because I now have so many somewhat trivial dates seared into my memory because I've just been going over them so frequently. Yeah, it was February 2nd of this year where she did her formal campaign launch speech in Hawaii. On that same day, NBC News timed a hit piece on her and released that piece on the same day. It was a Saturday, solely to undercut Tulsi and to make her look like a Russian stooge, because NBC News cited analysis from New Knowledge claiming that Tulsi Gabbard was getting an inordinate amount of support from Russian bots. So they actually specifically timed that piece to go out on a Saturday, which is not normally the day that major, blockbuster stories go out, explicitly so it would detract from her campaign announcement, and it would feed into this false perception that she's somehow backed nefariously by Russia. And Tulsi brought that up in service of cautioning Joe and the viewership that they should not take at face value any claims put forward by organizations like New Knowledge or similar ones who have been tried to capitalize on the hysteria around Russian social media activity, because they're so desperate to inflate the threat posed by Russia that they'll literally settle on Twitter trolls and Facebook memes as the crux of the supposed malign interference campaign that threatens to upend the very American system of governance. So that was notable as well. Obviously, there was a lot more that she talked about on the show. It went on for a long time. She also mentioned how she thinks that, at least in theory, it's plausible that antitrust law should be invoked against the social media companies to enforce free speech protections, so they can't arbitrarily expel people from the platform on the basis of their political speech, and also just to, in general, decrease their monopoly power, so that it's not just this cohort of tech guys sitting in the Bay Area somewhere determining what political speech is permissible for adults to consume online. And I find the journalists and the pundits and everybody who constantly celebrates every time somebody is thrown off these platforms, I find that so infantilizing, because we are effectively saying that we need Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and whoever's running, Google, I forget the guy's name. We need them to be the arbiters of what speech is too harmful for us to be allowed to consume. It's so weak and weak-minded and feeble. And I think Tulsi feels the same way. That's why she said it. Maybe antitrust law as it currently exists is not even sufficient to address the problem because it's such a new problem and we need actually a lot more thinking done on how best to approach it. That's being in the early stages of being done right now among people who are actually, very smart and taking a nuanced approach to this. But I think that was notable as well. She actually did also claim or affirm that the social media companies should be treated as public utilities. Even though they're private, they play such an outsized role in public discourse that to treat them as strictly private anymore is not tenable. And that's something I've been arguing for a long time, even going back to 2016. Standard Oil, back in its heyday, in the 19th century, was also a private company, but the government determined that because their power had grown to be so enormous, that legal measures had to be taken to diminish their power as a public service. And I think that's viable. I don't think it's a unjustified encroachment in the free market necessarily. Obviously, you have to be careful in how exactly you manage that governmental response, but I think it is definitely at least reasonable that it's something that should be considered. And actually, on my podcast with Tulsi in March, she told me that she does believe that there should be an expectation that these companies have an obligation to respect free speech, again, notwithstanding the fact that they're private. So that's the framework through which these companies, I think, are increasingly going to be viewed. You had Chris Hughes, one of the co-founders of Facebook, and Joe and Tulsi talked about this as well, writing an op-ed and doing a media tour last week, calling for the breakup of Facebook, calling for the government to break up Facebook. And he co-founded it with Zuckerberg, which is kind of amazing. I think some of Hughes' reasoning was a little specious. I mean, he was on CNN. I saw basically admitting that for the longest time, he had no problem with Facebook's rapid growth and the massive control it was accruing itself to dictate the terms of online discussion. So he was fine with that. He cashed out in 2012, his stock. So he's flying high. And it only occurred to him that this might be a problem apparently in 2016 when Trump got elected, in part supposedly because of various things that were going on with Facebook, whether it was old people on Facebook, declaring how much they love Trump or disinformation being propagated supposedly through Facebook. Only then did Chris Hughes think there was a problem. I mean, I find that a little hard to believe. And if that's actually true, if that's a true account of his evolution on this subject, then what does that say about him? I mean, he's kind of not entirely, I don't know, not the best arbiter of all these subjects. If he was so oblivious to the excesses of Facebook prior to 2016. I mean, in 2015, Facebook was very much extraordinarily powerful and was obviously on an upward trajectory to gain more and more unchecked power. So I kind of question Chris Hughes' analysis there. Anyway, watched the entire interview. It was really good. I don't even know if you would call it an interview, actually. That's not really what Joe Rogan does. It's more of a discussion. He actually talks quite a bit. I kind of wish he would have talked slightly less so Tulsi, the presidential candidate, could expand on some thoughts, but that's all right. It was still good. We're actually in a unique moment, given the proliferation of podcasts and YouTube and live streams and such, where a presidential candidate can go on a forum like this and speak almost, uninhibited for 2.5 hours. There's been no point in human history, really, where that was viable prior to right now. So that's kind of exciting in some ways. And, I was able to do the same thing with her on my podcast, which, again, people should listen to if they haven't. I'll link to that in the description box if you haven't seen that. So, yeah, I'll leave it there for now, and have a nice day.